Hi, first graders. Happy Wind Down Wednesday. I'm so glad you're here with us this evening. Find someplace cozy to sit and we will get started. We were off from school on Monday because it was President's Day, and we've been spending the last few days learning about presidents. We learned about two very influential presidents, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. Do you remember a fact about George Washington? Here's a clue. He was the first president. You got it. Do you remember a fact about Abraham Lincoln? Today, each student came out into the hallway and they measured their height against the height of Abraham Lincoln, who was 6 feet and 4 inches tall. Today we're going to be starting to read a story that I told you a little bit about in class. I gave you a clue that it has a character that everyone in class really loves. Flat Stanley. And not only is Flat Stanley in this book, but the topic of the book is something the class is very passionate about. Presidents! We're going to be reading a few chapters from the story, Flat Stanley's Worldwide Adventures, the Mount Rushmore Calamity. We'll read a couple chapters each evening over the next few Wind Down Wednesdays. Here's Mount Rushmore. The class was very interested in learning more about Mount Rushmore. Let's hear some facts about Mount Rushmore before we begin. Did you know that Mount Rushmore is in South Dakota in the United States? You could look on a picture of a map, either at your home or on the internet with permission from a grown-up, of where South Dakota is in the United States. Did you know that 3 million tourists or people who visit someplace come from all over the world to visit Mount Rushmore every year? Wow. Here are some other facts about Mount Rushmore. There are 4 giant carved statues depicting or showing the faces of famous presidents of the United States of America. The 4 presidents are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. Did you know that Mount Rushmore was originally named after Charles E. Rushmore, who was a famous New York lawyer in 1885? There are some friends in class who want to be lawyers. If you want to be a lawyer, give a connection wiggle. Historian Don Robinson is also known as Father of Mount Rushmore because in 1923, Don Robinson came up with the idea of building Mount Rushmore so that people from all over the world would come to South Dakota as tourists and promote or encourage tourism, right? Visiting a location. Gutzon Borglum was the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. Around 400 people had done this work together. They worked interdependently. The carving of Mount Rushmore started in 1927 and ended in 1941 after 14 years. Can you count to 14? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Washington's face on the Mount Rushmore sculpture was completed in 1934, and Jefferson was completed in 1936. Lincoln's face was finished in 1937. Tell someone at home, what's the year that we're in? 2023. Each president's face is 60 feet high. Wow! 1 foot is 12 inches. Wow, that's about this long, 12 inches. Right? Can you imagine 60 of these side by side? That's how long each president's face is on the sculpture. Their eyes are 11 feet, their nose is 20 feet, and their mouths are 18 feet wide. Oh my. Mount Rushmore cost $989,992.32. Hey, that reminds me. Remember I wore my penny earrings today? Do you remember what president is on them? Begins with the letter A. You got it. Abe Lincoln. Oh, I think you might find this fact interesting. There is a secret room behind the head of Abraham Lincoln on Mount Rushmore that contains or has all of the information about the mountain and also documents the history of America, right? Documents, keeps track of all of the history. Wow. If you're excited to read Stanley's Worldwide Adventures, the Mount Rushmore Calamity, do jazz hands. Let's read a few chapters together. While we're reading, I encourage you to practice the habit of mind that we learned about today, gathering data through your senses. Create an image in your mind while I'm reading and use your sense of touch, right, in your mind. Think about that. Think about what you might be touching, right, while you're creating the image in your mind or video in your mind of what we're reading, right? What might you see? What might you touch? What might you smell, taste, hear? That will help you with comprehending or understanding the story. Stanley's Worldwide Adventures, the Mount Rushmore Calamity. Maybe you want to bring Miss Falvey to where you're sitting. She might like to listen to a story about someone else who's flat. Here's the table of contents. Each week, we will read a couple chapters. Chapter 1, ready, set. Chapter 2, go! Chapter 3, Calamity Jasper. Chapter 4, into the mine. Chapter 5, on the trail. Chapter 6, around the campfire. Chapter 7, there's no place like home. The Mount Rushmore Calamity. You could pause the video and read this to yourself also. Chapter 1, ready, set. Sleeping bags? George Lambchop called out to his wife, Harriet. Check, answered Mrs. Lambchop. Wholesome stacks for the boys? Check, replied Mr. Lambchop. The Lambchop family was preparing for their vacation to Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills of South Dakota. They were each very excited about the adventure. Mrs. Lambchop was excited because Mr. Lambchop was excited because he was going to collect another state park sticker for the rear window of the car. That's reminding me of what we learned about in class this week. Data. A lot of people show data on picture graphs or through a tally chart or a bar graph. A lot of people can show their collection data on one of those charts. Mr. Lamb Chop could make a bar graph or picture graph or a tally chart to show how many state park stickers he has. Mrs. Lamb Chop was excited because she was going to learn more about the history of South Dakota. Their younger son, Arthur, was excited because he was hoping to meet some real, live cowboys. If you remember Arthur from the first book we read about Flat Stanley, put your thumb up. So remember, Arthur is Stanley's younger brother. And Stanley, the Lamb Chop's older son, was excited because he was going somewhere nobody would recognize him. Not long ago, Stanley had awakened to find that his enormous bulletin board had fallen upon him during the night. Give a connection wiggle if you remember that from the other book we read. Yeah, that's a text-to-text connection. Since then, the family had gotten used to having a flattened boy in the house. But when he ventured outside, he often caused a commotion. Look, Marge, there he is, the famous flattened kid. Wonder what new adventure he's up to now. Or, say there, Flatty, mind if we take a picture? So those are some of the things that are said to Flat Stanley. I wonder if he's already flat in this story, if he's starting the story flat. If you're also wondering about that, put your thumb up. Let's read on to find out. The truth is, both Lamb Chop brothers were getting a bit tired of the attention Stanley was getting. It would be nice, they agreed, to get away someplace where people didn't make such a fuss. Well, I think we're ready, said Mr. Lamb Chop, surveying the mountain of suitcases and camping equipment in the hall. If you're surveying something, you're looking it over, you're reviewing it. Not quite, dear, replied Mrs. Lamb Chop. Remember, we still have to consult Mr. or Dr. Dan about Stanley's travel needs. Better safe than sorry. What do you think it means to say better safe than sorry? Have you ever heard anyone say that? It means to be more cautious, make a more cautious decision, a decision to be careful, than to make a impulsive decision, right? Doing something without thinking, and then something happening, a mistake happening, right? So they want to check in with Dr. Dan about the safe way for Stanley, who looks like he's flat in this book already, the safe way for him to travel. Well, the boy is still flat, Dr. Dan pronounced when he finished with his examination. Yes, we know that, said Stanley's father. We were wondering whether such a trip would be suitable or okay for Stanley in his present condition. Mount Rushmore's elevation, or height, is 5,725 feet, for one thing. And we'll be traveling by automobile along the scenic highways at a fairly high velocity, or speed. Here, Mrs. Lamb Chop interrupted her husband with a chuckle. Not too high a velocity, of course, she said, meaning they will be driving the speed limit. Mr. Lamb Chop smiled at his wife's joke, but she and Mr. Lamb Chop were always careful to obey or follow local speed limits. That reminds me of our class community. We follow our class community norms, and we do an excellent job following the school expectations to be safe, responsible and respectful. Still, he said, we did feel it would be wise to check with you. What does the word wise mean? Smart. Yeah. It would be smart or wise to check in with the doctor. It's a good thing you did. More people should be concerned about the effects of travel on the body. This is what the doctor is saying. The human being is a very complex organism, right, or living thing. Even we doctors, with our extensive knowledge, don't completely understand it. Ooh, it sounds like Dr. Dan is talking about how he still has to remain open to continuous learning, one of our habits of mind. Oh dear, Mrs. Lambchop said anxiously. Will it be all right for Stanley to come with us? Of course, said Dr. Dan. I can't think of any reason why not. How do you think the Lambchops are feeling about getting that news that Stanley can go on the trip? I think they're feeling happy too. Chapter 2, go! The next day, after hearty or big breakfast, the Lambchop family began to pack the car for their big trip. What would you pack on your trip if you were going to Mount Rushmore? In went the tent, 4 sleeping bags, and the rest of the camping gear. In went the suitcases, the cameras, and coolers. Arthur came out with his arms full, his authentic cowboy saddle, which means real cowboy saddle, his authentic or real cowboy harmonica, and his authentic cowboy lasso, which means a real cowboy lasso. Oh, that image is really helping me create an image in my mind of what Arthur looks like. Oh dear, Mrs. Lambchop murmured, surveying or looking at the overstuffed car. There doesn't seem to be much room for the boys. Playing cowboys is for little kids, Stanley said. Now that I've been in the newspaper, I'm too grown up for that sort of thing. I think Arthur should leave all that stuff behind. Arthur glared like this, glared at his brother. Stanley can ride on the roof, he suggested. Mr. Lambchop considered this. Well, if we lash him down securely, I think not, declared Mrs. Lambchop. We will be pointing out many sights along the way. I don't want Stanley to miss them. And so both boys squeezed into the back seat with much grumbling, and the family set out. Raise your hand if you have to squeeze into your car when you're driving somewhere. Along the way, the Lambchops did indeed come upon many wondrous sights, inspiring cityscapes, fields of bountiful crops or fruits and vegetables, and numerous glories of nature. We should all be grateful to have good eyesight as we travel through this great land of ours, Mr. Lambchop noted. The rest of the Lambchops agreed. They were very fortunate indeed. Every time they crossed into a new state, the family recited or said its motto and sang its song. That reminds me of our class mantra that we created together. A mantra is like a motto. It's something that we repeat and we say, and it's connected to our class community. Just like these songs that they're singing are connected to the state that they are driving into. Tell someone at home, what state do we live in? They played license plate bingo and I Spy, and the hours passed fairly quickly. Nonetheless, everyone was delighted to arrive at the gates of Mount Rushmore State Park. The boys craned their heads out the windows to gaze up at the 6-foot-tall faces carved into the mountain, while Mr. Lambchop paid the admission fees. And as soon as the car was parked, they sprang out. I'm all crumpled, Stanley groused, trying to smooth himself out. Well, I'm practically flattened, complained Arthur. Boys, hurry along, said Mrs. Lambchop. We're just in time to catch the last tour group. The lamb chops fell in with a group of cheerful-looking tourists, or people who are not from that area. They're just visiting. In 1937, the tour guide was telling them, a bill was introduced to add Susan B. Anthony as a fifth face. This bill failed, right? The bill, it is when an idea is trying to become a law. But this bill didn't become a law. So today we still have the original four: Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln, who is directly below us now. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were fascinated by the interesting facts the tour guide related, but the boys wandered away from the group. They were still feeling a little rambunctious after spending so many hours cramped in the car. Raise your hand if it's tricky for you to stay still for a long time. Yeah. We do a lot of movement breaks in class to get all of our wiggles out. Tell your grown-ups at home what movement break is your favorite. They were also still feeling, it must be said, a little irritable with each other. Ha ha, Arthur taunted his brother from the edge of the mountain. I can stand right out here, but you can't. You'd blow away now that you're flat. Oh, he's teasing. Suddenly, the ground shook. Arthur, Stanley cried, you better come back. With a terrible sound, a large crack split open along Abraham Lincoln's hairline. The great carved face began to slide away down the mountainside with Arthur in it. On it. There we go. Without thinking of his own safety, so he wasn't managing his impulses, Stanley lunged out. He jumped out and grabbed hold of the retreating rock face. He held on tight. Climb over me, he called to his brother. Use me as a bridge. Arthur did. In a moment, he was back on firm ground where Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop ran to embrace or hug him. Just then a park ranger appeared. You, flat boy, can you hold on a little longer? He called out to Stanley. The repair crew is on the way. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were indignant. My son has a name, Mrs. Lambchop said. It's Stanley. Sorry, ma'am, the ranger said. I should have known better, because the same thing happens to me too. My name is Bob, as it says right here on my name badge. But to park visitors, I'm always just, hey, ranger. It makes me feel badly, indeed, as you can imagine. Mrs. Lambchop forgave Bob, and Stanley held on until the emergency crew arrived to repair the crack. Only then did he let go. When he righted himself, he was surprised by a sea of flashing light bulbs. A reporter thrust a microphone in his face. The boy who saved Mount Rushmore, one reporter crowed. That will be my headline for the evening edition. Brave boy becomes big Band-Aid, cried another. Off to the side, Arthur crossed his arms and frowned. Famous again, he grumbled, and nobody knows who I am. That's what Arthur's saying. We talked about that word jealous in class, right? It means when you are wanting something that someone else has instead of being grateful or happy with what you have. As soon as the reporters left, Stanley rejoined his brother in the large group that had gathered. Everyone was talking about the strange earthquake that had just happened. That warn't no earthquake, muttered a voice behind the boys. That was a gold mine. Stanley and Arthur turned to see a girl about Stanley's age, scowling. She was wearing a worn leather vest and chaps. These are chaps. and dusty boots with silver spurs. The boys introduced themselves. Good to meet you, partners, the girl answered. I'm the tour guide's daughter. The name's Calamity, Jasper. We'll be learning a little bit more about her next week. Thank you for joining me tonight. Have a great evening, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.